Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first roundtable of the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2022. This session is titled Divided Institutions and will discuss the role of the military and bureaucracy at the time of the partition and its aftermath. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via the chat to the chairperson. The questions will be consolidated for the speakers to answer. Today, we're delighted to have with us the following distinguished speakers. Professor Anirudh Deshpande, Professor at the Department of History, University of Delhi, India. Dr. Ilyas Chatta, Visiting Professor of History, Lahore University of Management Sciences, Pakistan. And Dr. Anvesha Sengupta, Assistant Professor of History, Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, India. I now invite Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and former Comptroller and Auditor General, India, to chair the session. Mr. Rai, please.
Thank you, Vinny. Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this roundtable on the International Conference on South Asia. 75 years of partition, we deal with rupture and connectivity, and we discuss with divided institutions today. Now, ISAS decided that in the 75th year since the partition of the Indian subcontinent, it was timely to examine the ruptures that followed the drawing up of new national boundaries and their impact on existing linkages and institutions. Now, it was equally important to investigate the new modalities, the mechanisms, the structures, and norms that arose from 1947 onwards to regulate, restrict, or redefine relations between the new states and govern the interstate relations. Now, this year's conference seeks to assess the impact of the partition on attempts to mobilities, emergence of new norms of structures, intrastate integration, forms of diplomacy, international relations, new arenas, protocols, and initiatives, and to explore the geopolitics and geoeconomics of connectivity. Today, in this roundtable, we shall explore the impact of the partition on institutions like the armed forces, bureaucracy, and the police. Now, it's a well-known fact that the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947 divided institutions, which brought huge inconvenience and disruptions in India and Pakistan. In 1947, the subcontinent was partitioned into two independent nation states. One was largely Hindu majority India and Muslim majority Pakistan. The drawing of the boundary proved to be extremely contentious, causing fear, uncertainty, and widespread destruction. Partition meant that millions of people found themselves on the wrong side of the borders, and it's assessed that 10 million became refugees in what was the largest population movement in histories. It led to one of the greatest migrations as millions of Muslims trekked to West and East Pakistan, later known as Bangladesh, of course, and millions of Hindus and Sikhs headed in the opposite direction. Now, across the Indian subcontinent, communities that had coexisted almost a millennium attacked each other in a terrifying outbreak of sectarian violence, with Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other. In Punjab and Bengal, provinces abutting India's borders with West and then East Pakistan, respectively, the carnage was especially intense. Now, military personnel who served and fought together to secure the imperial interests of the then British Empire were now members of the two new countries, protecting and often fighting against those who earlier they had stood alongside. Bureaucracy had to deal with families who suddenly found that they belonged to two different countries and had to cope with issues such as passports and visas across the street. Neighboring communities, accustomed to centuries of relative peace, suddenly turned so violent upon one another. Maintaining peace and harmony, ensuring good governance, and soothing the pains of partition became a major challenge. There were institutions such as the Election Commission, the civil services, the Auditor General, all of which had to be replicated and started afresh with new linkages and new authorities and fountainheads in the countries. Paramilitary forces like the Border Security Force had to face each other across the borders. Now, these are just the issues which we are proposing to discuss and debate today. And we have a stellar panel of speakers who will explore how the hasty process of partition affected security forces, the bureaucracy, trade, and financial institutions, including the economic inconvenience caused by the separation of industries, raw material supply chains, producing areas between India and then Pakistan. So without much ado, much further introduction on my part, I would like to pass on the stage to the panelists. And may I call upon Professor Anirudh Deshpande to start, please. Professor Deshpande, stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to the chair and thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak on this forum. I'm going to just underline a few points about the division of the Indian Army and the Indian Armed Forces in general between India and Pakistan, and the consequences of these divisions as they unfolded over the various decades in India and Pakistan both. Let's get some facts on our fingertips first. When the partition of the country was decided upon in 1947 in a very hurried fashion, the question arose about the division of assets and liabilities between India and Pakistan. And one of the most important organizations which had upheld colonial sovereignty in India was the Indian Army. And it was decided that 2/3 of the Indian Army would go to India and 1/3 would go to Pakistan. Now, which regiments would go to India and which regiments would go to Pakistan? And of course, this question also was addressed with respect to the other two services, which were newer services, the Royal Indian Air Force, which had some planes and ground staff and technical support staff and some, some spare parts and so on, as well as the Royal Indian Navy, which had gone up in a major uprising in February 1946, on which I have worked for a very long time. So personnel of all these three services, the Indian Army, the Royal Indian Navy, and the Royal Indian Air Force, were divided in the proportion of 2:1. So basically, 2/3 were given to Pakistan and India, and 1/3 of the 1/3 of all the assets, including the manpower in these forces, was assigned to Pakistan. Now, the most important consequence of this, and this process was made easy in the case of the Indian Army, because the Indian Army had always followed a recruitment pattern according to which the pattern of single class company and mixed class battalions had formed the backbone of the Indian Army. By battalion, we also mean regiments. Usually regiments or battalions used to have 1,000, 1,100 or 1,200 men each. And this would normally be divided in 3 companies of 300, 350 men each. And following the experience of Hindu-Muslim unity during 1857, and on the advice of the Peel Commission of 1859, the basic structure of the Indian Army was laid down, according to which the army was organized according, the base of the army was infantry and the cavalry, and the entire manpower of the army was organized according to the simple principle of single class companies and mixed class battalions. So as far as assigning companies to both the countries was concerned, this kind of recruitment policy followed over 50, 60 years made it much easier for the personnel to be assigned. So all the Muslim companies from all the battalions were transferred to to Pakistan. In fact, if you look at the Muslim component of the Indian Army in 1947, in the period 45 to 47, or even in the 1930s, you'll find that Muslims in general comprised about 32% of the Indian Army. It was a very heavily recruited community. And most of these, in fact, 90% of these Muslims recruited to the Indian Army came from Punjab. So the Punjabi Muslim, PM as they used to be called, Punjabi Muslim component in the Indian Army was very large as the Sikh component of the Indian Army. And then there were Muslims from Balochistan who were part of the Baloch regiment, and there were also Muslims from the frontier regions who were, the Pathans and the Pashtuns and Afridis and so on, who had been recruited into separate companies and battalions. So in any case, most of the heavy Muslim recruitment to the Indian Army had taken place in those areas which were partitioned in 1947, Punjab being the most important region, apart from Bengal, which was partitioned. So you have all the Muslim companies assigned to the Pakistani army, which was the Pakistan Army and the Indian Army were then two armies which emerged from 1947 from the partition. For a little while, they were led by British officers because Indian officers had still not gained those senior ranks, which began to happen from the early 50s onwards. So when India and Pakistan were at war, when they had their first border war over Kashmir in 1947-48, a large number of senior officers in both the armies were British. So 32%, the army had about 32% Muslims, which was a very sizable number of Muslims in the army. They had about 30 to 32 equal percentage of Sikhs in the army. I don't have the exact figure on my, on my fingertips, but must be somewhere around that. And about 33% of 30 plus percentage of the so-called martial races amongst the Hindus, in which you had the Dogras, the Jats, the Ahirs, the Kumaunis, and so on. And then you had the Gurkhas. The Gurkhas were a separate component of the army altogether. And when the question of partition arose, the most important question being addressed to the Gurkhas was whether the Gurkhas would like to join the Indian army or a large number of them would volunteer to fight in the British army. And the British army has actually continued to recruit Gurkhas for a very long time, since the Second World War. And there are several Gurkha regiments, Gurkha units, which are active in the British army. And they have participated as members of the British army in many parts of the world, notably in the Falklands during the War of 1982, where they were used as shock troops by the British against the inexperienced conscripts, Argentinian conscripts, who were at their mercy in the trenches and so on. So when a vote was taken amongst the Gurkhas, especially on the Burma front, the British came in for a surprise because they thought that the Gurkhas would overwhelmingly vote in favor of working with British officers. But as some books have told us, that when the results of this vote came out, the results surprised the British because a large number of, in fact, an overwhelming number of Gurkhas voted to stay with the Indian army and work with the Indian officers. So the Gurkhas, the greater majority of the Gurkhas stayed back with the Indian army. There was no question of their going to Pakistan because the Pakistani army was supposed to represent a kind of Islamic state. Pakistan was supposed to be an Islamic state at that time, although Jinnah wanted it to become a democratic liberal republic, but that's a different story altogether. So the great majority, in fact, 90, I would say 100%, almost 95, 100% of Muslims in the Indian army went to Pakistan or East Pakistan. The Sikhs stayed in the Indian army, obviously, and the Gurkhas also voted to stay in the Indian army. And obviously, the martial races from amongst the Hindus comprised the large majority of, in fact, those large majority of troops who served in the Indian army and continue to do so since 1947. The most immediate, impact of the partition on the armed forces was that on both sides, the armed forces became homogeneous. They lost their heterogeneity. The Muslim percentage in the Indian army drastically came down from 32% to less than 3%. It was about 2.4 or 2.5% in the early 1950s, when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, as the Prime Minister, raised an important question in the parliament about why so few Muslims were there in the Indian army. And his Minister of State for Defense, Mahavir Tyagi, replied that, there were only, I think, 2.3 or, roughly 2.5 to 2.4% Muslims in the Indian army, which at that, even by standards of the early 1950s, was very, very less, given the fact that Muslims in India in the early 50s, after the census of 51, gave a return of about 14% of the Indian population. Now, this remained the case, and both Hindus were distrusted in Pakistan. Pakistan had a much smaller minority of Hindus in their country compared with a fairly large number of Muslims who were left behind or who decided to stay behind in India after 1947. So India has the second largest Muslim population after Indonesia, if I'm not wrong. And this question has cropped up several times in Indian politics, but it has elicited opposition from various quarters. It leads to a debate in the parliament, and nothing actually is done about it. During the NDA-1 government, which was prior to 2004, when this question was raised again about Muslims comprising less than 3% of the Indian army, whereas by then the Muslims were about 16% of the Indian population. At the end of the debate, and this is on record, George Fernandez, who used to be the defense minister at that time, very clearly stated that the Muslims were not trusted by the Indian armed forces. So he's put it very bluntly in the parliament, and it's on. I mean, this is on record, and there are. I can check it out on the. If you just type in your browser, Muslim recruitment in the Indian army, you'll find all the references to that time. In 2006, when the UPA government was in power, a very high-level prime minister's high-level committee was established. In fact, they were thinking of establishing a high-level committee to look into this matter of a very low percentage of Muslims in the Indian army, but it led to a great uproar in the parliament. And finally, this committee gave way to what we know as the Sachar Committee, which came out with a comprehensive report on the condition of Muslims in India. So this is the fallout, both armies becoming homogeneous. If you look at the RIAF and RIN, in the Royal Indian Navy, for instance, we are told that people like MS Khan, Pannu Khan, who was one of the leaders of the naval revolt of 1946, went to Pakistan and was inducted into the Pakistani Navy by Jinnah's regime in the late in 47, 48. So we have this, although those who participated in the revolt in India were not taken back into the Navy at all. Now, that's a different question altogether. Now, one impact which this heavy recruitment of soldiers from Punjab and the northwest, generally speaking, the northwest of India, in which I would include Punjab, Balochistan, the frontier regions, and all those important provinces which now form part of Pakistan, West Punjab onwards. It had traditionally become a very heavy recruitment ground. It was the main military labor market of the Raj since the 1880s, 1890s. In fact, the military labor market, which used to be concentrated in the Indo-Gangetic plain, especially the areas of eastern Uttar Pradesh and North Bihar, changed. It shifted after the mutiny of 1857, in which almost the entire Bengal army went up in revolt. It shifted and under the impact of the martial races theory, championed by Field Marshal Lord Kitchener and some other officers of the Indian Army in the late 19th century, the bulk of the recruits to, let's say, about to the Indian Army, the standing strength of which remained about 200,000 for a very long time. Their army used to expand and contract during the wars because of wartime recruitment, but that's a different story altogether. Because of this, what happened was that a certain amount of militarization of the peasantry took place in the Punjab. So the Sikh peasantry in West and Eastern Punjab, Central Punjab, Eastern Punjab and Western Punjab, as well as the Punjabi Muslim peasantry in large parts of Punjab became very strikingly militarized. Many used to, many were issued gun licenses. Guns were pretty common. 12-bore guns were very common. Rifles were very common. Often, weapons were given to them as gifts. Guns were also pretty common in Balochistan and the northwest frontier province, where the Afghans and the Pathans were, they were usually armed, traditionally speaking, but as a consequence of their recruitment to the Indian Army, a greater militarization of the populations took place. So a certain amount of masculine culture, a certain amount of militarization, and a great amount of, great proliferation of weapons took place in this area. And this would prove to be momentous during the communal carnage which happened in the weeks which followed the announcement of the partition in 1947. So you find during the communal riots which took place on both sides of the Punjab, East Punjab as well as West Punjab, there are reports which entered various textbooks and other books on Indian history, which speak of military-style attacks on the so-called other and the enemy, military-style attacks on the other community. And often it was noticed that these military-style attacks were led by demobilized soldiers. Soldiers who had received training, combat training, and the use of a variety of arms during the Second World War, because the Second World War really expanded recruitment further in this area, and Punjab continued to remain, continued to record a very high, what we say, a very high MPR, which in military history terms is called military participation ratio. So the number of people,
would you like to wind up now?
Yeah, I'll just do that just give me a minute, So the consequences of this heavy recruitment of the military from this region and the militarization of the peasantry and the ethos of the martial races and masculinity, that seemed to have played an extremely important role with very important gender dimensions in the post-partition riots and genocides which took place in the Punjab. So to sum up, basically both the armies, the Indian Army, the Royal Indian Air Force and the Royal Indian Navy were divided between India and Pakistan. Pakistan getting 1/3, India getting 2/3. And both armies, Indian Army and the Pakistan Army, becoming very, very homogenized. I mean, more homogenized than they used to be earlier, post-partition. In the Indian Army, the percentage of Muslims has remained very low. They still are less than 3%, although their share in the Indian population is about 16-17%. So in fact, the share is quite low, and this has caused concern sometimes in the official and unofficial circles. As far as the Gurkhas were concerned, they voted overwhelmingly in favor of joining the Indian Army and serving Indian officers. And heavy recruitment from these areas, the tradition of military service and the proliferation of weapons on a very large scale meant that these returning soldiers, demobilized, unemployed soldiers, would play a very important role in the genocides, massacres, and riots which took place immediately after the partition and went on for several weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. That was very interesting. In fact, for a person like me who doesn't have a very detailed background of history, this information about the Gorkhas voting so heavily in favor of staying with the Indian Army has come as a pleasant surprise, because as you mentioned, I wouldn't know what was the cause or the reason why the Britishers thought that they would in fact vote to be with the British Army. We really don't know why they would have been so sanguine about that. And the fact that the demobilized, yes, of course, demobilized soldiers.
Orientalist and colonialist illusions of the British.
True. So demobilized soldiers, coming into the masses and then giving us an element of the military in the massacres that took place. Very interesting. Thank you very much for that background. Now, Dr. Ilyas Chatta, may I call upon you to make your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate. So just wondering, can you see my screen? Okay.
Can we have the full screen, please? Can we have the full screen?
Yes, I did full screen. From my side, it's full screen. So it might be okay.
Yeah, we have the full screen. We have the full screen.
Okay. Yeah, I can see.
Okay. Let me really start in 10 minutes. I try to wind up. What I will be really doing, what is the main theme in question? I will be addressing really three main theme. As from the beginning, Chair mentioned, it was really quite abrupt and hasty transformations, and then immediately after decolonization, state building project immediately starts to controls of the border, territorials. So the question here is not state building project. The question is how long it take, especially for border. What transition period was from soft border to hard border? We all know it's happened in 47, but when was actually border on the ground? When the border institution developed, security installation developed? I will argue really it took at least 50 years. It's not like as it was hasty, as you mentioned, it was not a easy process. It was complicated, lengthy process. So all these border institutions, revelation, it took at least, I will argue, 40 to 50 years build border on demarcations on the ground. And also it's, as you mentioned, also it's impacted on not on both sides of institution security, also impacted on the market, on the people's raw materials, how both Twin City was affected, like Lahore and Amritsar, and Firozpur and Kasur. So what was their impact on that borders? So let me really start with Van Schendel's work. Van Schendel's work was basically pioneer work on Bengal borders. What he really talked about, Bengal border was soft border as a whole. He talked about life cycle of border, like borders are how many beings. Then he talked about borders, Bengal border as an soft border. But when he compared with Punjab border, he talked about Punjab border from the beginning was hard border. When talk about partition syndrome, Wagah syndrome, as Professor Sen Gupta mentioned, immediately Kashmir war happened. So all these reasons, asserts. So therefore, that was Punjab border was adult and hard borders, and compared to Bengal border, and Bengal border was still jute smuggling, all grains, fish, and language issue was so that it remains soft border. But what I really argue is, I think in my book recently published in March, Punjab border was as soft as Bengal border. It was not really for next couple of decades. It was at least 40 years till so we can call Khalistan movement in quoted words. So that's I really argue in this one. But when I'm talking about this border, I'm just talking about border about only Punjab border. That start from South Punjab, from nearly Sindh and go to Kashmir borders. So that when I'm talking about soft borders, there was no institutions. It took like 50 years to develop all these demarcation, fence, and other border institutions. I'm much more talking about these 550 kilometers border. What I call really this border until 1980s, there was no demarcation, there was no much border, there was only some burjis. So, and overall, as that's basically as a summary conclusion, that was a porous border until Khalistan movement. There was no hard border, not militarized border. Cross-border solidarity, mobility, materiality was so common between Lahore and Amritsar. It was, despite the fact, abrupt and hasty transformation, but continuity, whether it was a raw material trade, to continue until in 1980s. Why? As again you mentioned, is hasty, and therefore borders happen on paper so quickly in 1 month, but on the ground it took years and decades. There was many reasons, really. I just like to sum up here. One of the main reasons was different interpretations of Radcliffe Award on the ground. And there was shared ownership of pastoral boundary, because both sides, peasant was community live, there was a shared boundary, share land order. So there was, after partition, there was many cross-border clash happened because of these share ownership happened between cattle communities, and also especially some area was like had Suleiman Ki and Fazilka, there was called Bela area. It's very difficult, largest Bela area in the region. So it was very difficult to demarcations. There was many infrastructure, zigzag. So they till 1960s, I'm talking, was swapping village because of these zigzag demarcations. So one of the main reason was also, I think I'm just work on it one, so reverent side of nature of the borders. So that I'll give you one clue. Here was different when negotiation happened between India and Pakistan. There's like especially just take one river Ravi changed massively its course. Many villages, 1,000 villages, sometimes there's like flood happened, they went on Pakistani side, then in Indian sides. So when there was different talk up, and this talk was happening in New Delhi, they're talking about, unlike the West Bengal border, the demarcation on Western zone is comparatively difficult over to the geographical nation of the two, nature of the two Punjabs because of all these rivers. So, and also there was a costly project for both sides. It was not easy from the beginning to start demarcations, and different institution was involved, from land revenue, needed demarcations, from water work and others. So then, and again, and also need aerial work for especially the riverside border. So then again, they approach Commonwealth countries to help for demarcations. And again, first time on Punjab sides, Punjab side, first time agreement happened 1955, and that happened only on land boundaries, and they leave that riverside boundaries. But that need to be ratified in parliament. India did, but Pakistan didn't. Pakistan was much more concerned on eastern borders, on Bengal side border, because much more smuggling happened, jute and others. So therefore, all border institutions develop on eastern side of border, but not on western side of border. I wouldn't much, I think Dr. Anvisha maybe throw light on this slide, because project seems to be on what all the institutions develop on Bengal side border. India justice in 1952, let's start with passport without visa, because of both sides are same for jute. And even Pakistan put curfew on it, operation closed door was there. And even when Ayub took martial law imposed, and he also mentioned all these hoarding and smuggling happen on eastern side of Bagan. But then we compare with Punjab borders, there was not much really. Till after nearly a decade, there was not a fixed date yet for demarcations. So till in 1956, Nehru wrote to the Pakistani Prime Minister, let's fix a date, rigid date to demarcation. So that was, as I mentioned, there was reason was many, Pakistan was not much more interested on Punjab side of border, but was much more on Bengal side of border, because porous border, as I argue in my book, much more beneficial to Pakistan. And then eventually, then again, army came in 15. And then first time agreement happened, because all the Pakistani civil government was hesitate to get any agreement. And then army came, and then first time different villages, they swap India and Pakistan, different land, pastoral land swapped with each other. And then first time in 1960s, that Burji, I mentioned, in the Burji they start putting pillars on it. But again, then war happened and there was no talk between both countries nearly decades. So then Khalistan movement happened and India on one-sided start putting fence, leaving some area, that controversial area, that was disputed area on Pakistani sides. So that was, fencing was all Indian project. There was, Pakistan didn't pay a single penny. Pakistan was not much interested. Again, until now, it was all Indian projects on Pakistan, on Punjab border at least. Here is a bit summary to just wind up. When this demarcation happened, it was not immediately happen as much as argue. There was a partition syndrome. No, it was not. It happened quite late. It continued in 60s and border was still porous even after 65 wars. There was no talk. And first time fencing like start in 87s and there was still until 2015 it was continuing, and in Kashmir it was only start 2004, and many times Pakistan resisted this fencing project. And also like other institutions that will say like there was securitization border, there was not much securitization border, there was not institutions on borders. That was basically on Wagah. That was the main custom post, and there was not much border installation there. Mainly porters and coolies, they help crossing border in a different way, illegal way. So same really like Professor Sam Gupta mentions. Here is also a bit detail, as Sir Rai also mentioned. Border police force and other agencies when they came to border. There was until 60 only was police, local police was there, like a local Thana police helped them. But Rangers came in 60s probably after war, 65, and mainly all these management border regimes was installation basically. Again, it came in 80s. Reason was again Khalistan movement, India's internal problem, not external problem. So, and also I think that's will be the last point. And also another way is also affected in two cities, Lahore and Amritsar, in a different way for raw material, for market, for kinship relation, commercial and social. But as a whole, when legal lakes stopped and illegal was really continue, and a level was more than legal for more than legal. Here is some borders agencies report, like intelligence reports, and they mention there's really hundreds and hundred was, but the business like is like a business like manner. They were using transport and others to exchange a good bit continue between different kinship relation, people on both sides also, and also on both sides was border security was helping, especially in Lahore was most of the stuff coming from Lahore and Delhi. Here is like everything was really like anything was required in Lahore and Amritsar, they was exchanging, whether it was a gold, a gun, a food grain, dry fruit, sports good, you name it. It was for fruit to medicine, even historical manuscript was smuggled. So that was all really coming, and the tens of thousands of people on both sides was traveling, massive mobility was there because the border was so porous. So why was reason basically there was massive after partition. That's another sort of bit distraction. There was other one reason was there was after partition. There was a variation on prices. Almost some price was double in Amritsar and in Lahore, from clothes to pan to gold, from whiskey. So that was the reason. For one reason that was quite profitable. So that was basically officials, and also I gave there was also unofficial was more than legal. So also this is a little last point. Also after partition, that's one of the reason after partitions, Lahore's mainly marketplaces, market institution developed because of partitions. and all product was the consumer goods was coming from in Indian side, Lahore and Amritsar, and Pakistan's agencies especially was lenient about consumer goods, because after partition, especially if you take pawn and clothes, that was mainly migrants' consumption was they went for nearly 75% above then. There was not much official trade, so that all coming through other we call smuggling sources. So I conclude here. What I'm really arguing as a whole, partition and security study mainly say, as we argue, 1947 was a closing off period. But I'm arguing, no, there was a continuity persistent after a long time when boundary was on the papers. So there was not much really, for Punjab side, there was not much more security zone or partition syndrome, militarized better, even after 65. So border institution, all these regime develop after in the wake of, mainly in the wake of Khalistan movement. And also in this period, Lahore's marketplaces developed and urban regeneration happened. There was like a different kinship relation in Delhi to Lahore, and all these marketplaces was there. So it's only really ended, old gold day was not in 47, old day goods end in after Khalistan movements. And one was reason also, there's many other reasons, the price for consumer, as fences start, consumer goods really from 50% and 70%, and gold went in, because all smuggling was happened through gold from Pakistan. So 100% gold prices up in India because of these fencing, as smuggling and illegal trade was less. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Dr. Chatter, thank you very much for that good introduction. That continuity did not end in 1947, it continued. And of course, trade has continued. But of course, the issue is that border management, the regime, which has been started on both the sides, is so expensive on both the sides. And despite that, I'm actually very surprised at the long list that you just showed to all of us about the items, the commodities which are moving from one side to the other side, despite the fact that the fencing has been done, and which means the porosity continues. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation that you've made. Now we move on to our third panelist, Dr. Anvesha Sengupta. May I call upon you to make your presentation?
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity. I hope the slides are audible. Slides are visible. Okay, so I'll start. So this basically the paper has I think too much numbers and facts and figures. So what I have done is that I have just put the facts on the slides just to make it more easy to listener friendly. So I'll start right away. Partition had complex implications for the jute economy of deltaic Bengal. The border between East Pakistan and India separated Bengal's jute fields from the jute factories. East Pakistan received more than 75% of the total jute growing land of undivided India, whereas the mills were in India, mostly surrounding Calcutta. Moreover, Calcutta was the primary port through which the jute was exported. Most jute dwelling centers were also located in and around this city. Thus, at partition, the jute economy of Bengal ran at the risk of being fragmented. India and Pakistan, eager to avoid an economic crisis at this critical juncture, signed a standstill agreement ensuring that there would be no export-import duties on any commodity, including jute. However, between these two dominions, including jute moving between these two dominions till March 31st, 1948. But conflicts erupted when East Pakistan, as the chief producer of raw jute, demanded a share of the annual revenue that the Calcutta port earned from exporting it. When India did not agree, East Pakistan began to levy a duty on the fiber, and 14 land customs collection centers were established for this purpose by the end of December 1947. Thus began the disentanglement of long-established networks of jute circulation. For the next 1.5 years, India and Pakistan remained engaged in various negotiations regarding the transaction of raw jute and jute products across the Ratcliffe line. But it was in September 1949. But it was in September 1949 when the jute economy faced the full brunt of the partition. Till 18 September, 1 pound was equivalent to $4.03. From 19 September 1949, 1 pound became equivalent to $2.80. So what happened was India immediately devalued its currency, whereas Pakistan did not. For the first time, an Indian and a Pakistani rupee were no longer equivalent. This created the following problem for jute business. Pakistan continued with its previous prices for raw jute, which meant that Indian mills now had to pay 44% more. The Indian authorities decided to fix the maximum buying price at 35 INR, which was equivalent to around 15.5 Pakistani rupee per mond of jute from East Bengal. But the Pakistan government declared 23 Pakistani rupee to be the minimum selling price for every mond of raw jute in the baling centers till June 30th, 1950. A simple mathematical calculation would reveal that Pakistan was asking around 7.5 Pakistani rupee more than the Indian mill's sanctioned price. The situation worsened when the Pakistani government seized 60,000 bales of Indian jute that were coming to Calcutta from Assam through Pakistan. Moreover, 5 lakh bales of Pakistani jute, for which Indian merchants apparently had already paid before devaluation, were also detained for lack of proof of payment. To pressurize Pakistan, India decided to stop coal supply to Pakistan towards the end of December 1949. Pakistan received 23 million tons of coal from India annually at that point. Thus, a full-fledged trade war began. Some of the immediate consequences of the coal scarcity were long hours of blackout in Dhaka, a scarce increase in the price of kerosene, and a sharp increase in the price of kerosene, and slowing down of work in the jute baling centers. To limit coal consumption, several Calcutta-bound trains and steamers were cancelled, making the journey between two Bengals difficult. It seemed that India and Pakistan were headed towards a severe diplomatic crisis. Amidst this jute coal conflict, a clash between the communists, who happened to be Dalits, and the police in a village of Khulna further complicated the politics of the time. On December 20th, 1949, the police assaulted an Omoshutru communist family, and in the scuffle, a constable was killed. On the following day, the police attacked the village, which was primarily a Dalit settlement. The incident took a communal turn when the local Muslims also attacked the Omoshutru houses. Soon the riots spread across East Pakistan and in different parts of West Bengal and Assam. Known as the February riots, this was the first communal incident affecting Eastern India and East Pakistan since partition. Though the immediate trigger for the riots of 1949-50 was a local clash, several contemporary accounts cited the ongoing jute coal crisis as the more crucial reason behind it. 60,000 mons of raw jute were burned down at the baling center of Narayanganj on 6 January 1950, or that jute mill areas of West Bengal were the worst sites of communal violence at this time were not mere coincidences. Jute had now become both a cause and a symbol of animosity. The widespread riots and the severe economic crisis brought India and Pakistan to the negotiating table, and the Nehru-Liaquat Pact was signed on April 8, 1950 to address the situation. Additionally, the commercial transaction between India and Pakistan also resumed. It began with shipment of West Bengal's detained jute, and India released coal to steamer companies to carry the jute over to Calcutta. Coal was specially supplied to the steamers for carrying refugees from East Bengal to West Bengal. Finally, a formal trade agreement was signed at Karachi on April 21st that promised 4 million mons of Pakistani raw jute to the Indian mills in return of 20,000 tons of jute manufactures from India. But it did not end the ongoing jute war. India and Pakistan signed and breached repeated trade agreements about jute throughout the 1950s. It was rapidly becoming clear that neither of these two neighboring countries were ready to manage jute economy collectively. They were desperate to become independent in terms of jute economy. For India, developing a self-sufficient jute economy would mean increasing the production of raw jute. A Grow More Jute campaign was launched immediately after partition. As a part of it, while efforts were made to expand jute cultivation beyond traditional jute growing areas like Bengal and Assam, like in Madras, Travancore, and Bombay, in West Bengal, simultaneously a substantial amount of paddy fields were also converted to jute producing areas. Between 1950 and 1952, according to the figures provided by the government of West Bengal, 243,000 acres of paddy lands were diverted to jute. In East Pakistan, the need was that of massive industrialization and infrastructural development. New baling presses were ordered within a few months of partition. In 1951, 3 jute mills, the Bawa Jute Mill Limited, Victory Jute Products, and Adamji Jute Mill began to operate. The facilities available at Chittagong Port also improved. Before partition, Chittagong handled an average of 2 lakh jute bales per year. Between July 1948 and June 1949, the handling facilities were increased to 1 million bales. From January 1948, ships began to be regularly loaded at Chittagong for ports across the world. By then, a few all-weather barges had also been introduced to carry jute from baling centers to Chittagong. The bale jutes were also declared as Class 1 priority for railways connecting the baling centers to Chittagong. During the devaluation crisis, when India, the largest buyer of Pakistani jute, was absent from the market, a 3-member jute board was also formed in Pakistan to combat the possible consequences. An ordinance was issued by the end of November 1949, allowing the government to determine the minimum selling prices for jute and also to appoint purchasing agents. By mid-December, the province had 68 purchasing agents buying jute directly from the growers. The agents were particularly active in the border region to curb smuggling. They were instructed to buy all jutes within 10 miles of India-Pakistan border. Smuggling in jute, however, remained a major concern for Pakistani state throughout the 50s. No amount of state intervention could completely curb it because of jute board's inability to ensure fair price to the cultivators and high demand of raw jute across the border. Though attempts to separate jute economy encouraged immediate agrarian and infrastructural development in India and Pakistan, it did not prove beneficial in the long run. While India and Pakistan were busy developing their self-sufficient jute networks, the world, ironically, was moving away from Bengal's jute. Many countries had begun to experiment with substitutes like paper and kenaf during World War II, when the supply of jute and jute products became uncertain, particularly to the United States. Partition intensified this trend. With the total breakdown of Indo-Pakistan jute diplomacy towards the end of 1949, an acute shortage of packaging material was felt across the world. With the beginning of the Korean War, the need for jute and jute substitutes became even more serious. Various jute substitutes were tried by different countries in response to this in response to this crisis. An article published in Economic Geography in 1950 listed at least 19 natural and synthetic fibers that were being used. Another article published in 1952 in the same journal informed how, besides kenaf, various experiments with other soft fibers were going on in different countries. A study conducted in 1961 by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, London, in collaboration with the United Nations, concluded that the importance of jute as packaging material had declined in the main industrial countries as the I quote, substitution effects had been adverse to jute. It predicted a decline of 40 to 60% in the jute consumption ratio between 1957 and 1965. Between 1957 and 1970 in industrial countries, and a decline of 10 to 20% in the jute producing countries. Thus, the glorious days of jute were over. The partition had a significant role to play in this. In their attempt to nationalize jute, India and Pakistan emerged as unreliable supplier of the fiber and jute product. So when the subcontinent had developed infrastructure to sustain two self-contained jute economies, the golden fiber had lost most of its glitter. It goes without saying that the consequences would be devastating for the mill workers and the peasants of both the Bengals. But that is a story that needs to be told separately. Thank you.
And Dr. Sengupta, thank you very much. A remarkable example of how this sudden drawing of boundaries, drawing of borders has made a mismatch where you have 75% of jute growing in East Pakistan, then East Pakistan, and you have all the jute mills around Calcutta. A remarkable mismatch, and how jute substitutes developed. And ultimately, it was India and Bangladesh now which have lost out to substitutes which have been developed in other parts of the world, and that the, as you call it, the golden fiber has lost its glitter. But more interesting is the fact of how non-purchase of jute, not enough supply of coal leads to power dislocations, and how communal clashes break out because of these commodities not being supplied and jute becoming a symbol of animosity. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think we've had three very interesting and divergent presentations. And I think it's time for us to pass on some of these issues to our participants. One of the questions I'd like to present before the panelists is, when the internecine struggle was going on between the masses, the communities on both the sides, what was the role of the administration on both the sides? Was the administration mature enough? Was the bureaucracy seasoned enough? Because the British had withdrawn, though the heads were still the British, heads of the departments were still the British, but were the lower rungs of the bureaucracy in a position to be able to manage or soothe some of the tempers that were rising? Who would like to take it first?
May I put in a comment on that?
Please go ahead.
You see, if you look at the events which started unfolding from 1946 onwards, because serious communal outbreaks began to be reported from 1946. So once the wave of popular movements, which were entirely secular in orientation, things like the Royal Indian Air Force strike in the late 1945, the naval revolt of 1946, the Subhash Chandra Bose birthday celebration riots in January 1946, when all these movements had been put down, at the same time, peasant movements were growing in Bengal, and there was the Telangana movement, which was also developing in the Hyderabad state. So once all these secular movements had been put down, you find that the complexion of politics begins to change rather rapidly from the time when the call for direct action was given by Jinnah, which is August 1946. And in almost all instances of communal riots from 1946 to 47, you find that the bureaucracy does not distinguish itself as a service capable of taking timely action and nipping the evil in the bud. The British bureaucracy, especially the British civil servants, had got into the habit of encouraging communal divisions amongst the Indian people. The British had followed a policy of divide and rule for a very long time, and they had not evolved efficient mechanisms to address communal conflagrations. When it came to putting down secular uprisings, or when it came to crushing workers' movements or peasant movements, the bureaucracy and the police seemed very efficient. But since the lower rungs of the bureaucracy and the police themselves were heavily communalized by the 1940s and early 1946, 47, even to expect that these police forces and the lower rungs of the bureaucracy would behave in an objective fashion when the actual riots and the genocides took place is a little too much. So my view is that during the partition riots, especially, you find apart from stray instances when bureaucrats really fulfilled their duty, many senior bureaucrats, of course, had got wind of the changes and they had shifted their families much before the actual partition took place. Most of the English were busy preparing to leave India at the earliest, and Wavell had actually, if you see Bal Singh Chawla's book on Wavell, you find Wavell had already drafted an emergency plan according to which the British were planning to very quickly quit India as soon as the independence, as soon as the civil unrest broke out and the independence was granted. So in my very considered view, especially in the 8 or 10 weeks following 1947, especially till the end of 1947, mid 47, I don't think that the Indian bureaucracy or the Indian police, I'm not talking about the army. Many army units behave very responsibly. They protected people, they rescued people, and it was the army convoys and the army trucks and lorries which actually helped many people escape with their lives on both sides. But as far as the local police was concerned, as far as the lower level, especially the lower level bureaucracy was concerned, I don't think these services distinguished themselves, acquitted themselves very well in the mayhem which took place immediately in the aftermath of the declaration of the partition.
Dr. Chatta, would you like to take a crack at it? Especially, why was Pakistan, not showing interest in the fencing developing? Because later on, this kind of smuggling was beginning to hurt their traders also.
Yes, I can just build on Professor Sand. Basically, we can divide really what you mentioned before partition and after partition and say communalized bureaucracy. But I think after partition, especially in Pakistan, you can say really was much more ethnic or maybe regional sort of bureaucracy. I don't know what terminology you use, mainly from
Ilyas,
Punjab.
My name is Professor Deshpande. You have constantly referred to me as Professor Sengupta.
Sorry. No, Professor Deshpande, sorry. So you distract me. So sorry. So I think that what was basically let I give you really for figures really. If we're saying as a whole in Pakistan, what really you mentioned early, tens of thousands, millions like a refugees came. Only really as a whole in Pakistan was something like as a whole in bureaucracy was 10%, but as a whole in bureaucracy was in Pakistan, in UP or another area was 50%, and more than 50% was migrants bureaucracy after partitions. So there was basically as a whole, as a policy making, whether in a refugee settlement, whether is anti-India narratives, that's all developed, and even religious nationalism because of all the suffering was happening over there. And also, I think that's also a need to mention here, there's two other ways we can link with borders, and also is also after partition, there was a long, I think I can quote one word for Wazir Azimida, bureaucratic violence. That's really happened through again after partition. It's continued until today. That's also through how what you mentioned, whether they was capable or not. In India, probably 1965, all these vacuum property, all these institution was finished, but in Pakistan, it still continue. Even today, vacuum property secretary or settlement secretary still exists, and then every day still hearing happen, every day still bureaucratic violence, and their settlement issue is still happening. So that's all And also from the 50s onward, if we can first decade, it was almost predominantly bureaucratic sort of regime in a different way. And also this time also corruption discourse happened in Pakistan because of all these reallocation of Hindu and Sikh properties happen, and all these favor and kinship happen. Let's again come to the borders. Not really all these locally rooted low bureaucracy was on the border, but what they was reporting to Karachi, the main bureaucracy, what was they was all these border reports and other. One border report say 100%, almost 100%, every borderlanders involved in smuggling. So such kind of narrative like territorial sovereignty was happening. I think that happened from the beginning in first 10 years, and that much more continue. And there was only then two non-migrants. Ayub and then my ruler came, like a Bhutto came. Then there was a different sort of cleansing of bureaucracy. Then many hundreds and thousands bureaucrat was sort of arrested and sacked and other, because there was a perception as a whole the bureaucracy was corrupt, and that all corruption discourse was and argue in different places. One of the reason also you mentioned in a different speeches, one of the reasons for martial law, and I think so. Whether we say whether they were capable or not, so I'm doubt.
Okay, there's an interesting question that we have, which says, what were the societal or the social problems which the partition caused? And I guess the reference is that the differences which partition caused between communities, between religions, between neighbors, and people who had been friends and colleagues earlier suddenly started seeing each other differently. What did it? Was it a catalyst at that point of time? Did it suddenly boost up that kind of feelings of animosity? Who would like to take it? Professor Deshpande, would you like?
Yeah, Raisa, which is this notion that suddenly happened and then people began to look here and there and so on. This is more for popular consumption and it comes out in the media. But if you look at the work of Anita Inder Singh or David Page on the prelude to partition, and the kind of the virulent communal politics which had gripped the country in the 1920s, 30s, and even early 40s, you'll come to the conclusion that these things, communal prejudices had grown to very large proportions in society. The communal prejudices, especially in Punjab, Bengal, and some parts of the country, ran very deep, and that communal organizations of various kinds were flourishing, both amongst the Muslims and Hindus as well as the Sikhs, and these communal organizations received the backing of the colonial state, which did very little to arrest the flow of poison which these communal organizations had initiated in the body politic and society in the 1930s, 20s, and so on. So this whole notion, I mean, you obviously after every event, you have people who look at it either in terms of the binaries which the events leave them with, and on the other hand, you have people who look at the past with some amount of nostalgia. But then memories of both kinds undergo transformations over 50, 60 years, 30 years, 40 years. And sometimes they become reliable, sometimes they are unreliable, and so on. But there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that communal organizations, communal cultural organizations, communal publications, and communal provocations and riots were not only common on a very large scale in the 20s and 30s, but they were allowed to happen, they were allowed to proliferate by the colonial state, which always followed a policy of divide and rule, thinking that a division between Hindus and Muslims, Sikhs and Muslims and so on, would help prolong their rule in India, but they didn't realize that they would be hoist with their own petard after the Second World War, with a large mass of demobilized soldiers, who were partly secular, partly communal, and who became complete victims of the circumstances created in a hurry by an exhausted superpower which wanted to get out of India as soon as possible. So, I mean, this whole narrative that, all of a sudden it happened, and then, I think in a way these massacres and these genocides were, the British and the Indian leadership, as well as the bureaucracy and the police, were culpable in creating conditions in which these genocides took place. And it's a matter of shame that nobody has been brought to book so far, as being culpable for creating conditions in which millions of people, innocent people, lost their lives almost needlessly. And I don't see any reason why the partition of the country could not have happened over, let's say 2, 3 years or 4 years, in which people would have been given time to settle their accounts and, put their house in order, and then they could have, chosen to stay where they wanted to stay. But all this being done in a matter of weeks, and by a man who had never been to India before this. Ratcliffe had come to India for the first time. And immediately after putting the plan in operation, he said very clearly that now I am going to go. I mean, people are actually looking for me and hunting for me. I'd rather go back to Safdarjung Enclave and sit there quietly for the first plane out of India to England, because I don't want to be found here, after these, obviously, after this criminal act which he had committed. He should have refused, because he had never been to India, had never been to Punjab, and these were things which were being done on paper, as as Dr. Chatta has pointed out, and as my own work on the BSF, which was founded in 1965, points out, that the borders were not only porous, the borders were not defined. The borders are very difficult to define, both between India and Pakistan and India and China. These are not, these are fairly easy to define on the map, but when you see the ground realities, borders are not easy to define. And to play around with, people's lives on such a scale was, downright criminal, if I may say so. And the British are culpable for this. They are culpable of this, and they have not been punished for what they did to the country in 1947.
Dr. Sengupta, you've talked about jute trade and jute diplomacy. Those times when you did not have trade agreements like the FTA, the Foreign Free Trade Agreement, or the most favored nation kind of treatment, how do you think could the two countries have balanced out supply and manufacture of jute products such that the other countries were importing jute products did not start looking for substitutes as early as 1950 itself? Do you think they could have done anything better?
So I don't know what they could have done, but clearly the policymakers thought that policymakers thought that it would be prudent not to disrupt the economy, to cooperate among themselves. And so that is why there was the standstill agreement till 31st March 1948. And after that, repeatedly, they tried to get some kind of, they tried to have agreements. At least on papers, there were repeated agreements, and they tried to favor each other and to have a kind of cooperative infrastructure which could allow the functioning of the jute economy as it was functioning before 47. And that brings me to the first question that was being discussed. And so I think there was continuously these two contradictory trends. On one hand, the administrators and policymakers and also the politicians were trying to cooperate and have some kind of common institutions, common economy, common infrastructure. And on the other hand, there were areas of conflicts. And over the years, the areas of conflict kind of expanded and the areas of cooperation reduced. However, I think there is this as Professor Deshpande said, and I agree that this lower level of bureaucracy, which was, if you read H.M. Patel's autobiography, who was representing India in the steering committee, and Muhammad Ali was representing Pakistan in the steering committee, and these two people were in charge of basically dividing the assets and liabilities. So H.M. Patel says that they were great friends, but the lower rung of bureaucracy, who were seeing these everyday riots more closely, they were not in a mood to cooperate as such. However, just another point where it depends on the kind of commodity. So how bureaucrats were reacting, it also depended on on what they were dividing. So when it came to National Library, the assets of the Imperial Library, they fought tooth and nail over it. But when it came to the typewriters of Ministry of External Affairs, they were very eager to cooperate and divide among Karachi office and Delhi office. So my argument is, it is a certain kind of ideological assets, if I may say so, and certain kind of infrastructural assets invoked different sentiments from the senior bureaucrats. And yeah, that is it.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have a very hypothetical, but I think an exceedingly interesting question, and I call it hypothetical. Dr. Chatta, if you can attempt it first, and then Professor Deshpande. It says that in 1947, if both India and Pakistan had not divided the armed forces and carried on with a united military force, would the tension between the two countries have become what they have become, and would a nuclear option on both the sides develop at all?
Well, I think, again, Professor Deshpande will be best person to answer, but I really take from a bit lead from what he earlier really said about, look, really, in even colonial periods, most of Muslim, what you call Punjab or Muslim army was in Punjab, and certain, it was not as a whole Punjab. It was only in, like a catchment area. There's a few districts like a Jhelum or a Attak area that, and still Pakistan's army really majority, can't know the figure, but must be more than 50% same area. Colonial period was same, still area same, and they still probably control whole other region and Pakistan as a whole. So that is basically catchment area. Whether, I think, can we say that will be a particularly will be a good relation, or there's a new nuclear, I don't know really, but I personally say the army will be still very strong, and same that area, the area is what is called sub-valley, sub-mountain, and all these ones, so it will be highly dominate, and it will be not so as sometimes is mentioned, whether it's wise India is more development, or Pakistan is a security regime, or all these militarizations. I think is when we talk about, we must take that regions, not as a whole, really talk about Sindh, Balochistan, you mentioned South Punjab. So I really, rather than make any comments, I will leave it Deshpande, he can go ahead. Stop it.
Deshpande, very interesting. How do you think the modalities?
Really, I wonder whether Dr. Chatta has a degree in diplomacy. Diplomatically, he is very, he's actually.
I'm so naive on this.
No, usually I refrain from responding to counterfactual, counter-historical questions, because frankly speaking, there's no point in debating possibilities which never happened. As a historian, I'd rather debate what happened, and and I've often thought about this as a political historian, as a military historian, as an economic historian, and so on. I feel we blighted our potential as a united country in '47, but we had a chance, and I think that chance lay in keeping the borders soft and open between both the countries, like some of the European countries. You see, France and Germany have been They've been traditional rivals and they've fought wars in the 19th and the 20th centuries. But now, see how they manage their borders. Similarly, you have Germany and some parts of East Europe and Central Europe. And Germany, there was a time Germany was a disliked power in Europe, especially from the late 19th century onwards till the 1940s, for reasons well known to everybody. But see how they have developed the EU and how in what mature fashion they handle their borders. And I also feel that now with the latest scanning techniques and the latest techniques of surveillance and so on, I don't think it would be possible for anybody from either side to take weapons or explosives or other damaging stuff or contraband and so on to the other side. So if we have an open border and we allow people to mix freely and have a cultural exchange all the time, then many of the misconceptions which people have about the other, on both sides will vanish. But I don't know whether the politicians and the military establishments will like that or not, and I'm not in a position to comment on that. So that's the only hope you have. Otherwise, these are two nation states, and there is no way they can unite in future. But they can be very friendly nation states, mature nation states, open and liberal nation states. I mean, I, for instance, would love to go to Pakistan on a very long tour, but I can't do it simply because the Pakistani government will not give me a visa. And I'm sure many Pakistanis would like to come and visit India and stay here for a long time. But the visa regime is very strict. And frankly speaking, we, both the countries have handled this problem rather in an infantile fashion for a very long time. And I think the time has come. If we have to save money on defense expenditure, that money which has to be spent on education and health and other facilities which both the countries lack. But then with Pakistan, there is a problem. The army rules the country, and it is said that nobody who is not anti-India will ever come to power in Pakistan and will not consolidate his power, because the army will start opposing that person. About India, I'm not going to comment at the moment. So frankly, it can be handled in a more mature fashion. But as far as the counterfactual questions are concerned, I think that's best left to school students and college students. That's something which we can't answer.
I think it's best left to crystal grazers. They might be able to predict better these kind of questions. Yeah. But believe me, those of us who have managed to get visas and traveled across the borders, it's a very pleasant experience. The community.
Yeah, I keep reading about all those things, but unfortunately, I've never been to.
Yeah, but I have a couple of times, and I find it's a very pleasant experience. You find people to people, society to society, official to official. The relationships are so warm, heartwarming, that you feel that yes, there is kinship among the people of the two countries. Anyway, now let's look at a very positive side of it. And I think this can be taken 1 minute, 2 minutes, each one of you says, what is the significant positive outcome of the partition?
I really argue there is
Dr. Chatta?
Two sides of partition. There is, as a whole, really, I argue in my new book and in my previously PhD, there is a gainer and there is a loser of partitions. And that could be people, that could be region, that could be institutions. What we're really talking about, whether military benefited from partition or not. Let's talk about really they expanded this one. Let's talk about regions. Region, whether which region was a loser, whether Amritsar or Fazilka or Lahore was benefited or not, in many ways, culturally or materiality, whatever the reason. Whether same like a Sialkot was there, my PhD was on the Sialkot, whether Sialkot as a sports industry was benefited for partition. When all these Sialkot migrated, when in Ludhiana, and they built same, they went with skill and all these sport industry or surgical industry, how Ludhiana benefited from partitions. So let's for region, institution, let's talk about peoples. How like a Sialkot people was basically 90% was Hindu and Sikh was all tycoon, industrialist and other. The labor was Muslims and Christians. How they took over industry after partition, and the upward economic mobility happened with them. How the certain people in Sialkoti, all Sialkotis are benefited from partitions, and also and that's positive and positive note. Let's come for other way. How a vacuum property, when we talk about vacuum property, really as like let's say our main city, urban city like Lahore, really 90% Lahore the vacuum property was non-Muslims, Hindu and Sikh. They left all industry, houses and other. It was basically almost 80-70% Pakistan was reallocated to again migrants and others. So who benefited from that one? A particular again a particular class emerged. I call sometimes particular elite emerge after partitions, and they benefited in different ways, especially if you have vacuum properties, and they, you can call them whether they were non-agreed area, agreed area. That means for Punjab side or maybe UP and other sides. So there is, I think, I will just sum up. There is like a theory kind of gainer and loser, and could be people, regions, and institutions.
Professor Dr. Sengupta, would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, 3 points. First is that women, there's this general consensus among many historians who have worked on Bengal that women, particularly the refugee women who came to West Bengal, they in many ways this was a moment of emancipation for them, because for their family needs they had to take up work, they became educated. So in that way it has been seen as a moment, in some way it was in the long run it was a positive moment for women emancipation. Number two is the fact that actually it's not, it's something that Professor Kudasia and Professor Tantayong had argued in their very important book, that how the agrarian development of Indian Punjab was related to the partition. It happened because of major transfer, how the Indian state, how Punjab government could reallocate land among the refugees, had control over the evacuee property and reallocate them among the refugees. And the third point that I want to mention is that because by invoking the crisis that partition that was related to partition, India and Pakistan, both the states could accumulate a lot of power, which generally do not associate with a democratic country. So they could send people to Andaman almost in a way, in a similar fashion that colonial state had sent bonded laborers. They could take property from the minorities and redistribute it. So this kind of power, this kind of exceptional power, they could bring in exceptional property legislations. So I would say that by invoking crisis, they could accumulate a lot of power. If you say this is a positive outcome, then yeah.
Yeah. Well, Professor Deshpande, would you like to spend a minute on this?
Yeah, historically speaking, all tragedies have consequences, and some people lose, some people gain. That does not take away from the magnitude of the tragedy. So there is hardly any period when migrations don't happen and people relocate, take their skills along with them, develop new factories, new, I mean, to make it sound a little absurd, tomorrow somebody might even turn around and say that even the Holocaust had certain, it had fallouts in the sense that businesses owned by the Jews were taken over by the Germans, and all the insurance policies of the Jews were taken over by the German state, and Hitler actually contributed and developed a huge segment of Germans who became his beneficiaries as a consequence of the properties of the Jews and other people confiscated by the German state. So, of course, the partition is not like that, but people lost a lot. And after that, people rebuilt their lives, and there was a great struggle, which is not as if they began to rebuild their lives very quickly. People came and they had to struggle a lot. And this struggle also had an impact on their mentality, on their cultures. Of course, people like me who've lived all their lives in Delhi, grew up enjoying Peshawari food in the outer circle of the Connaught Place, where the Peshawaris were given places to set up their restaurants, and the Peshawaris became very good. I mean, they are known for their cooking skills and their non-vegetarian dishes and so on. But then when I used to talk to the old timers, they used to tell us, what a great struggle it was. It was not easy. So even when you look at this quote unquote positive outcomes of the partition, these positive outcomes of the partition are underlined with a great amount of pain, loss, sometimes nostalgia, sometimes very painful memories, and that we should not forget.
No, I think that was a very good ending to it all. I have some very interesting questions even now about glorification of gun culture and issues like that. But then I think I see Vinny threatening me on time. And well, subject is very intriguing. Your presentations have been absolutely wonderful. But the subject is such that the deeper we go into it, the more comes out. And there are, of course, learnings from a subject of the kind that you have all dwelt upon. All three panelists, thank you very much for giving a very diverse analysis of the picture which had emerged, which, the more that is said about it, the less it is. But I think a very interesting presentation from each one of you. Thank you very much for joining us on this roundtable. It was an excellent experience. Vinny, may I hand it over to you?
Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank all the speakers for such an insightful discussion. I'd also like to thank all the participants for being a part of this discussion. Please also do join us for the next roundtable session that will commence shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.